Welcome to Sales for Nerds. I'm your host and chief nerd, Ruben Swartz. If you started a business because you love serving clients but realized you didn't like the sales and marketing aspect of running that business so much, this is the podcast for you. Sales and marketing doesn't have to suck. It can actually be a lot of fun. And on this show, we're going to teach you how to connect instead of network, teach instead of market, help instead of sell, so you can keep serving people even while you're building your pipeline and growing your business. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm super excited to have with me Tom Jackobs, known as the Impact Pilot, for helping small business owners sell their services better through speaking and telling stories instead of just pitching. Tom is actually joining me from halfway across the world in Taiwan right now, where it is close to midnight and it is close to noon for me here. So it's a little early. So I am doing a first for me on this show. I do not have any tasty beverages other than my water with me. Tom, what do you have in your glass?
I have water, but it has mint leaves and a lime.
All right. Cheers. Welcome to Sales for Nerds.
Cheers. Thank you.
Before we dive into storytelling, or maybe this is part of storytelling, let's let people know why you're joining us from Taiwan.
That is a really good story, too. So I sold my fitness business 5 years ago, and that was in Houston, Texas. And I wanted to travel the world. I didn't want to have just a home base. So I was trying to figure out like what I could do as a remote entrepreneur. And so I started consulting and doing sales consulting as well. And that I started traveling around, and I was living in the Philippines in 2019. And in March of 2020, I decided I wanted to come to the US for a 2-week visit. I had some events scheduled, some speaking engagements. And this thing called COVID came about. And I was literally on the last flight out of Cebu, Philippines, when they shut down the airports and shut the borders off. I got into Taiwan, luckily, and everything was still open for 2 more days. And then I saw what was happening in the US, and all my events got canceled. And I was just like, well, I think I'll just stay here. And so that 2-day layover turned into 3 years now.
All right. That is a great story. I mean, it's an unfortunate story in many ways, but it's interesting and it seems like you made the most of it. Now, how did you go from a fitness business to a consulting business?
Very good question. So when I first opened that business, it was 2008, and I knew nothing about sales. And I almost went broke within the first 6 months of owning that business because I didn't know how to sell. My typical sales process would just be give out my card to whoever came into the studio and give my price. And then surprise, surprise, they didn't always buy. And then once I started learning about sales, because I realized that was my weakness. And so I started to do a lot of study. I hired a coach and really figured out what sales really was. And to me, it became a mechanism of solving somebody's problem. And it was really that simple. They came into me with a problem, overweight, out of shape, what have you, and I needed to solve that problem with my program. And so once I learned that whole technique of, identifying what the problem is, holding up the mirror, giving my presentation, solving the problem with my presentation, then closing the sale, it was a process that I repeated over and over and over again. And I had a 90% close rate when people came in. And that just really invigorated me. And sales became something that I just absolutely loved. And then the company that was coaching, I was doing coaching through, they asked me to be one of their coaches. And so I started coaching while still owning my fitness business. I started coaching other fitness entrepreneurs, and then started selling their program, and then started selling their program from stages. And over the course of 3 years working with them, I closed $4 million of coaching programs for them. And, all over the world. I've traveled to Australia and UK and America.
So you clearly learned the program quite well and applied the lessons on so many levels. Now, you said you got to about a 90% close rate. What approximately was your close rate at the beginning?
I don't know, because I wasn't tracking it, but I know it was pretty bad because I was going broke. And that's something that all salespeople should be doing as well, as tracking their sales and knowing their close rate. It's so funny, as a somebody that came out of corporate work, handled millions of dollars in freight, but I couldn't run a small business. I didn't know my numbers. And that was like the first thing that my coaches kind of worked with me on, is like, know your numbers, what, profit and loss. I'm like, what's that mean? So it was quite the learning experience going through that. But obviously it all worked out very, very well.
Now, I'm curious as well, when you made this shift from sort of like, here's my card, good luck, to let me solve your problem, uh, obviously your close rate increased dramatically. I'm wondering if you have any remembrances or thoughts or whatever about the feelings you had when you were having those conversations.
Yeah. So, just handing the card, it's $60 a session. Buy 10 sessions, you get the 11th for free. That sales technique didn't work. It worked to a certain point, like maybe 10%. People that were really interested in doing it, they did it. But when and it would just seem transactional to me. When I went to a consultation, and now it became a 45-minute consultation, and I really got to learn about that person. And oftentimes we would share tears or share laughs, and it was very transformational for myself and for the prospect as well. And actually the process that I went through, the very first time I tried it out in the whole process, I made my first sale, and I sold 100 sessions for $5,500. And when I asked, going from maybe doing 10 sessions for $60 each, so $600, to $5,500, was just, my mind was blown. And when I asked the lady, I was like, my famous clothesline is, based on my professional opinion, you could do it in 50 sessions, but I really recommend, to get your goals and really sustain this type of lifestyle, that you do the 100-session package. Which would you prefer? And then I just shut up, because that's usually when you talk yourself out of a sale. And it was like a minute, and I was in my head, I was like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have offered 50. I should have offered 10 sessions. She would have bought that. I know 10 sessions would have been good. And then she's like, yeah, I'll do the 100. And I was like, I think actually I said, are you sure? And then, took the credit card, swiped it. I was like, oh my gosh, it actually went through. It's like, I've never seen that amount of money in my business before at one chunk. It was an incredible feeling.
So then you clearly you get really good at selling, and one of the things I love about your story is, like, you didn't have to do a 28-step process or whatever. It was basically just, let me shift this to listening to what they want and making sure I'm delivering what they want via my programs, as opposed to, here's my program, you figure out how this may or may not solve your problem.
Yeah, exactly. And before, I was selling the program, working out. And what's one thing that most people don't want to do? It's work out. And so if you're trying to sell something that people don't want in the first place, it becomes a really hard thing to do. But then once I shifted to selling the result, what they get from it, more energy, better body composition, better health, then that's when I believe that the sale really took off, because now I was selling something that they wanted, not something they didn't want.
Right. So now you start coaching other fitness professionals, other businesses, and it is this when you start traveling?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would do little presentations and teach people how to sell, and coach them through knowing your numbers and all that, because I got really good at it, because I'm really good at following directions. I'm very process oriented. So it just came naturally to me, I think. But then but I had to work at it at the same time. And that's the funny thing about sales. I think when I was growing up, I always thought, oh, you have to have the gift of gab, and you have to be really outgoing, and you have to, like,
Right.
do all this stuff to be a really good salesperson. And the reality is that I'm introverted. I really don't like to talk to people all that much. And yet I could sell at a very high level, because it was a process and I knew how to work the process. And
And
that's, I mean, that's the key thing that I teach everybody is just follow the process.
well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I'm imagining some really critical parts of the process involve actually listening. And sometimes that's a superpower that introverts have, because sometimes we actually just want to listen and we're not just preparing the next thing we're going to say.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't like to talk. So it's like even better. So yeah, the listening skill is the most important. I always tell people, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, use it proportionately.
Yeah, you don't learn too much by talking. You learn a lot by listening, especially when you're trying to figure out what the actual problem is and how to solve it. Let's talk a little bit about how do we take this process and use stories along the way so that it's easier and more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started to introduce then in my sales process, especially when I was doing the presentation piece, I would start to tell stories about the clients that I'd worked with that would have gotten really great results. And you wrap that, I call that the social proof story, the testimonial story, and which is really important. But then what I think really made a difference is when I started to tell my personal story, because now they were personalizing the business with me, and now it became a human and not a business.
Hmm.
And I had gone through my own body transformation. Over a 12-week period, I lost 40 pounds of fat and gained 10 pounds of muscle.
Sorry, how
And
many
I was
weeks?
12 weeks.
That's what I thought you said. Okay, wow. All right. Sorry, go
Yeah,
on.
yeah, yeah. No, it was pretty incredible time when I did that. And when I share that with people now, they see, this personal trainer, and it's like, oh, well, you don't know what it's like. And I showed my before and after pictures, and like, okay, you know what it's like. Okay, great. Here's
Right.
my credit card.
It's amazing. And I think I always tell people, don't have this sort of like boring resume or list of credentials. You have an origin story for how you became this superhero. And there's in fact a field in my CRM that says, what's your origin story? Because it's probably the most powerful story we have, especially because it lets us do what you said, right? It lets the prospects understand that we have walked that journey and we know where they're coming from. And they can then relate to us instead of, oh, here's some guru up on a mountaintop who was enlightened and didn't actually understand the struggle.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And one thing that really a lot of business owners struggle with, though, is which origin story or which story in my life should I actually talk about? Or they're just uncomfortable talking about themselves and like, oh, I don't want to talk about myself. It's not about me, it's about them. I was like, well, your story is about them. They need to be able to see themselves in your story and how it relates to your business. That's the only way, like, a really good storyteller is involving their audience in with the story. And that's what really creates that connection between the prospect and the seller.
So if you've got an origin story of I lost 40 pounds in 12 weeks, would you like to do some fitness training with me? That's obviously, I mean, I can't imagine having a more relevant story than that. For folks who
Yep.
maybe have a variety of stories and they're not sure which one to pick, because they're all sort of somewhat applicable, but maybe not that dramatically. How do they go about choosing or crafting the story so that it's true and authentic, but still effective?
Very good question. So the very first thing that I work with people on is getting an inventory of all their stories. And so they'll list out all the stories that they can think of, good stories, bad, good outcomes, bad outcomes, the tragedies, but also the comedies as well. Those are important to share. It doesn't always have to be a tragic story. But they list it all out. And then I have them go through and kind of relive that story. And I'm watching them as they do that. And I'm looking for breath rate. I'm looking for like a little shift in their seats, something that's showing a physiological reaction. And the story that they're thinking about, and I ask them as well, is like any story like bring up anything for you, like you get sweaty palms, you're breathing heavier, your heart rate's going up. And I say, yeah, this story right here. It's like that's the one, because you want the one that's most emotionally charged, so that that emotion comes through while you're telling that story, and the audience is going to feel that emotion really deeply, and they're going to be even more connected with you. I watched one speaker, and he was telling his story, which was pretty amazing story. He's like survived, stage 4 skin cancer, and he was telling this story like he was just going down to the park and going for a walk, and it's like almost dead and blah blah blah. And I was like, dude, like, what a great story. Put some emotion into it, and it would be an outstanding story at that point.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because I think a lot of times when we tell our own stories, we're either uncomfortable sharing the emotion for whatever set of reasons, and or we're just sort of desensitized to it because it's been turned over so much, right? And the time we stubbed our toe yesterday might be more dramatic than the major medical issue we had a decade ago. So how do you know, if you're just looking for those physiological clues, that that's the story? I mean, obviously, like the cancer story, that seems like it's pretty easy to tell. That's an important story. But for a lot of
Right.
these blander, more boring professional stories, how do you select? How do you know, hey, this is the one that you should tell with more emotion because I think it actually did rile you up at the time and you're just forgetting about it, kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, when I get them to go back in time, so they're just taking their memory and they're putting themselves into that situation again, that's when that emotion will start to come up again.
Okay.
And that's what I train them to do before they go and give a speech, especially if they're doing selling from the stage, is before you go out, because that signature story, that origin story is always the first thing that you start with. And I get them to just relive that moment. So then the emotion is fresh in their head. And
Got
I
it.
have one story that I tell over and over again. I probably told it 100 times. And every time I get that lump in the throat, and I have to take a moment. And every time I tell that story, people are like, they get it. Right. And it's crazy that even after, I think it's been 12 years now, that emotion still comes up.
There's also perhaps less of an issue, but I think maybe it's a generational thing. I feel like older folks are more likely to be a little bit too walled off, and some of the
Mhm.
younger folks I feel maybe are too open or maybe even performative about their emotions because they're like looking for likes on Instagram or something almost. How do you strike that balance, or am I just an old curmudgeon who doesn't know how to share his emotions properly?
I think everybody has it within them. I think, if you're talking about like the Instagram people and all that, I think that is totally made up. And you can feel that if it's over the top. When it's authentic, it's true to you. People can feel that. And everybody shows emotion differently, but the feeling still comes through the same way, if that makes sense.
If it's real.
Yeah. If it's real.
Got
If
it.
it's made
Okay.
up, which, thinking back now, maybe that cancer story that the guy was sharing wasn't real. Maybe it wasn't real because there was no emotion to it. But it could also be that he's just desensitized to it as well. So I don't know.
Now, how long should these stories be approximately?
Well, that depends on the situation that you're telling them in. And so you should always have at least three versions of the same story. You'll have your elevator story, so 1 to 3 minutes, usually about 1 minute. You can knock it out in about a minute to a minute and a half. And then you have like a 5 minute version of it. So if you're doing like a quick talk, or you're doing a sales presentation, that would be a good place for a 5 minute talk. And then if you're doing like a longer, like a keynote address or something like that, then you're going to have your 10 minute, 15 minute story that has a lot of detail. There's just a lot of color and texture to it that, gets the whole audience involved in it.
Now, if let's say you're doing 30, 45, 60-minute presentation, you start off with an origin story. Are there other places that you should be weaving similar story snippets in there?
Yes, absolutely. So on anytime that you're giving a teaching moment, or you're telling about your services in some way, You should also be weaving in a testimonial or a client success story in with it, or call it a case study about somebody that had that particular issue and then was resolved with your product or service.
So you're telling stories, but it's not your story anymore. It's the client's story.
Exactly. And you make them the hero versus in your own story, you're the hero in that story.
Right.
And in that client story, you're the guide in that story. You're Yoda in that story. And so ultimately that prospect is going to see themselves as the hero of that story, and then
Mhm.
you as the guide taking them through it.
Well, hey, this has been awesome, Tom. I know it's getting really late for you there. I could talk about this stuff for forever, and you probably could too, but I feel like you probably want to get to sleep. If people want to know more about you and maybe take their storytelling to the next level, where can they find you?
Yeah. So my website would be the best place. So that's Tom Jacobs, JACKOBS.com. And then I have a special gift that will help them kind of create their first stories. So it takes you through the process of creating that story. So if you go to tomjacobs.com/storybook, then they can download that free guide and go through the workbook.
Awesome. And if for some reason you're driving or cycling or whatever, we'll have all those links in the show notes.
Awesome.
Tom, appreciate you making the time so late in your day. Cheers.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Drop an iTunes review or a review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you've got a friend who would benefit from this episode, let them know about it. If you've got a friend who wouldn't benefit from this episode, but you just haven't talked to for a while, now's a great time to give them a call. Thanks for listening. Until next time.